Welcome back to the second video of this video course series, Theme 1, Part 2, and today we're going to talk about the exam, the AP Biology exam. So, let's just briefly talk about how the exam is structured overall. So for the MCQ or the multiple choice questions, you'll have 60 questions to solve within 90 minutes, and this will worth 50% of your entire score. So you'll have, let's say, roughly 1.3 to 4 minutes per question, taking into account that you also have to mark your answer choices in the bubble sheet. And you will also take, after a short break, the free response questions or the FRQ, where you'll be asked to solve 6 questions within 90 minutes, which is worth 50% of your score. But do note that this does not mean you'll be only asked 6 questions. Like say for number 1, there will be subsections like A, B-1, B-2, all right? So it's 6 big questions, but there will be a bunch of small questions that follow these big questions. So you'll see that both sections are equally important. Say for AP Lang, the AP English Language and Composition exam, like let's say if you get a perfect score, which is 18 out of 18 on the FRQ section, you can like miss half of the MCQ, which is, let's say, around 23 out of 45. And you likely still land on a 5. But just take into consideration that this no longer is the case for AP Bio exam. On the test day, however, you'll be provided with select equations and formula. This means that you do not have to memorize all the equations that I teach you, but you do have to understand how each equation functions for the unique context of each question. And let's briefly talk about scoring. So the exam itself is not necessarily the curve. It's not really curved, but it's scaled. So if you go to, let's say, Google and just search up AP Bio score calculator, you'll be able to see how the exam itself is scaled, meaning that they have a predetermined scale of how each raw score converts into a single AP score, and I'll explain that briefly later. So for each MCQ question, there's a 60 total. Each question is worth a single point. However, for each small FRQ question, which you have a total of 36, it's worth 1.7647 points. So this means that missing two MCQ questions is tantamount to missing a single FRQ question. So you do need to focus on acing the FRQ section. It's quite important. And you'll see that range of 5 is quite high. So let's take a look at this. So you'll be familiar with the concept that for AP score, you either get a 5, 4, 3, or 2, or 1. But there's a raw score, meaning that there's a range of score that results in a single AP score. You'll see that from 92 to 120, 120 is like the perfect score. You'll see that from 92 to 120, that range of score results generally in a 5. But just take into consideration that this changes every year based on the relative difficulty of the exam, right? So it might depend year by year, but that's like the general trend of what's going on. So which that means that you can miss up to around 10 MCQ questions and 10 FRQ questions, and you can still land on a 5. But this is actually quite dangerous. I would say this is still a cutoff score to get a 5. So I highly recommend that you say miss around 5 to 6 MCQ. And because generally FRQ questions are deemed way more difficult, around 8 FRQ questions, that will generally result in a safe 5. All right, so let's briefly talk about how the MCQ section works. So again, 60 questions, 90 minutes. But interestingly, for the AP biology exam, each multiple choice question has something called a stimulus, meaning that for each question, you'll be provided with a description, graph, lab data, or diagram. So let's say it's not like standard exam. Like, let's say it's not going to be like Chicago is a city, state. So it's not going to be simple as this. It's not going to ask you simply about the concept, but it's going to ask you about the application of the concept. So let's briefly take a look at this question. You'll see that this question is a typical MCQ question in the AP Bio exam. And you'll see that before reading the question, there's this stimulus material or a diagram for each question. And there's 4 answer choices, right? So this means that by reading the stimulus, you must understand what the question is asking you. I'm going to teach you how to ace this part, but let's say, for example, this provides you with a DNA sequence. So you should pretty much infer that you'll learn, it'll be based on a topic from the DNA unit. And you'll, although you might be not familiar with this, you will learn what's the problem with the sequences, how do they differ. So as long as you have this logical flow of the concept going on in your brain, you'll get the gist of what this question is getting at, what this question is trying to test you on. And actually, and interestingly, some stimuli have multiple questions accompanied. So there might be a page-long description of lab data. So there you'll be seeing some charts, and there will be a bunch of descriptions, and there will be like question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. So you might have a set question. And in order to ace the MCQ, it's very important to think MCQ as the FRQ. So after understanding the question's point, so before understanding the question's point, you should definitely understand the stimulus, right? So by understanding stimulus, you get the gist of what this question is getting to. And by reading the question, you now have a clear understanding of the question's purpose. I recommend think to yourself, how would you answer this as an FRQ? If someone were to just ask a question to you, how would you answer it? How would you word it? I highly recommend choosing a question choice or the answer choice that best represents your prediction. The difficult thing with biology exam is that all answer choices, they technically and scientifically are valid. So they all make sense in some way. So you must choose the best description. This can be only done by understanding the gist and the clear point of the question by thoroughly analyzing the stimulus materials and the question that follows by. And I'll say this is really important. 10% incorrect and 90% correct is a 100% incorrect answer choice. It's like, let's say there's a long answer choice and you see a single word that makes it incorrect. This answer choice is entirely incorrect due to this 10% inaccuracy. However, let's say there's an answer choice and sounds 70% correct and 30%, I don't know. This likely be the answer because you're asked to choose the best one. So again, it's very important to understand that even a single word or a phrase that makes the answer choice incorrect makes the entire answer choice incorrect. And for the exam, time pacing is important because the MCQ section, the timing is really tight. As you're given less than 1.5 minutes per question. So it means that you should understand the prompt thoroughly at first glance to minimize rereading. So let's say you fail to understand the question at first glance, then you're going to keep going back to the question or the stimulus material to understand where this question is going. So this first glance impression is very important. So analyze the stimulus. What concepts are you observing? And I highly recommend spending a minute per question so that you have around 10 to 15 minutes to mark your answer choices and also double check. Make sure that you do not make any stupid mistakes. And if you cannot find the answer, skip for now. Okay? Never spend too much time on a single question. Okay? This is highly not recommended. And always leave that 5 to 10 minutes buffer time for final check and marking. I know students who spend like, let's say 87 minutes to solve the question, and they only dedicate 3 minutes to mark everything. You will eventually find that marking the answer choices are actually quite challenging because you're prone to making really dumb mistakes when you're under tight pressure and time limitation. And this is something very trendy going on with College Board. So AP Biology exam has 4 answer choices per multiple choice questions, and it generally contains those 4 answer choices generally contains 2 wrong choices that are just irrelevant. This means that they're just out of context. They're just out of context. It might be factual though, but they're just out of context, meaning that it just doesn't make sense to fit in to your understanding of the stimulus material and the questions point. And always there's this distractor. It sounds correct. And the thing is that they word this distractor so nicely. It's so nicely worded. But it really does not answer the exact prompt. So a lot of students, so let's say I'm taking this MCQ section. So a lot of students, they know these 2 choices. They're just wrong. If you know the content, you just know they're wrong. But they stop between these 2 choices. So distractors are generally nicely worded that you're likely gonna choose this answer choice, but that's a wrong decision. The distractor generally does not answer the exact prompt. The correct choice, however, answers the prompt and is relevant. Okay. So there's this minuscule difference between this distractor and correct choice. And why are they doing this? It is to discern students that will get a 4 and that will get a 5. Okay, so by choosing this correct answer choice, you're telling the College Board that, hey, I know my concept and I know what's going on. let's go through an example. This is actually from United States history, but I just brought this as example that we can just go through just to help you understand um, how MCQ works. Okay, so this document, I'm pretty sure everyone should be familiar with this. It's adapted from Declaration of Independence, published in 1776, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and others. So I know that during this period, they were trying to gain independence. Why? Because they were so mad at those taxation. And I know that a lot of new principles, like the idea of democratic institutions, what's going on. So see, I only read the half of the stimulus material, but I'm making a bunch of connections to the contents that I already have in mind. And I know that these were the founding fathers. They are the founding fathers who introduced, the new ideas. So I see how these connect. Then let's try to analyze this excerpt. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay. So I know that this is a landmark quote from the Declaration where they have this fundamentally changed perception in human relation. Okay, so I think this is enough. So you'll see that only by reading this stimulus, I made a bunch of analyses based on my previous knowledge. Okay, so let's go to the answer choices. A, increasing demand for workers' right and security during Industrial Revolution. Okay, so historically this was correct, but this is out of context. So this is that just wrong choice. Elevated understanding of universal equality during Enlightenment era. Okay, so it sounds similar to the understanding of the excerpt here, that there was a changed perception in human relation. Okay, so maybe. Intolerable taxation to American colonists by King George III of Great Britain. All right, so this also sounds very luring. It sounds very correct. And the question asked you, the quote above is a likely response to. Was this quote itself a direct response to the intolerable taxation? No, it was more about how they have this renewed perception in human relation based on my understanding of the stimulus. So this is this distractor that I'm talking about. It sounds right. It lures you. It always sounds right. And it's worded so nicely that you're going to choose this at first glance. But that is actually a very wrong approach. And let's go through deep. Civil War. All right, it's just wrong, right? So you'll see that there definitely is a distractor that makes the College Board discern who truly understands the content. Okay. So now let's go through the FRQ section. So I told you there's a total of 6 questions that you'll be solving. And there are 2 long questions. So 6 questions. The first 2 questions are the long ones. And the remaining 4 are the shorter ones. And you're given 90 minutes. And I highly recommend starting with short questions. So I highly recommend going in this direction. Why? It's just better to get warmed up. Think about it. Your brain will be fried after this intense MCQ section. And generally, long questions are known to be way more difficult, and you have to write more. But short questions are generally simple, and they require a shorter answer. So it's easy to get yourself warmed up and focus. And it's highly recommended that you use around 10 minutes per question. All right. That means that you'll have approximately 50 minutes remaining, right? And for the long questions, I recommend using around 15 to 20 minutes. 20 minutes, I guess, is a sufficient amount of time for you to analyze the stimulus and answer everything, which means that you'll have around 10 minutes remaining for final check. So you see for long questions, questions 1 and 2, each long question has 4 to 5 small questions. So let's say this is question 1. You see part A, part B, part C, part D, and part E. And each small question may worth 1 to 3 points. So let's say part A might worth 2, this might worth 3, 2, 2, 3. I don't know. It changes year by year. And there's a specific and impartial category for scoring, which means that you need to answer all the question prompts. So let's say if the questions ask you A and B, you do have to answer both prompts. Then what are the prompts that each question covers? I recommend focusing on the verbs. Let's say a question might ask you to explain something, justify something, or describe something. Or the question might ask you to identify something and justify. So by focusing on the verbs, you understand what the question is asking you. And generally, the long questions, they have a page long or even longer stimulus that covers a certain experiment with a hectic list of results. So generally, for long questions, I recommend you to understand the stimulus thoroughly and make connections and write down any observations that might help you in answering any of the FRQ questions and try to recall the concept. And for small question 1, right, because there's generally 4 questions per 4 small questions per 1 big question. The first question will always ask you to explain the concept related to the stimulus. So let's say the experiment is about growing a cell. Then it's going to ask you something about cell. Explain some kind of component in a cell. And the small question 2 is always going to ask you to identify the experimental factors. So what's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? Stuff like that. If you do not know what these are, it's totally fine. And small question 3 will ask you to describe the results. And small question 4 will ask you to predict the experimental results or improve the experiment or propose a model. So generally assumed to be the most difficult part. One of the 2 long questions for either small question 1 or 2, it will require you to draw a graph. Okay, so you do have to know a little bit about how statistics work. But I'll teach you, do not worry. And for the short questions 3 to 6, again, the practice remains the same. Understand the stimulus and always make connections to the concept. Question 3, short question 3 generally is about an experiment, about an investigation. Question 4 is about conceptual analysis. They'll give you a scenario. Question 5 is going to ask you to analyze a model or a visual representation of something, and question 6 will ask you to analyze the data. And a bunch of other strategies will be covered in the FRQ. This is a typo. All right. So I'm pretty sure this video allowed you to get the gist of the entire AP Bio exam. So there's the MCQ section. You're given 60 questions to solve within 90 minutes. For FRQ, you're given 6 questions to solve within 90 minutes. And for FRQ, there's 2 long questions and there's 4 short questions, and each question will have a sub question. And for MCQ, there's always a stimulus. I think the stimulus applies for both FRQ and the MCQ. So the exam itself is quite simple, but it takes a bunch of practice to get you to master how this exam truly works and where you should be going. All right, so I think that provided you a thorough understanding of how course and the exam for AP Biology generally, a typo, how the exam itself generally functions. In the following videos, we'll be covering the concept. Now is the real part of AP Biology, where you learn about how biology interacts as a system. All right. So I hope to see y'all in the next video. Have a great day.